All right, welcome to the Otherppl show. I am Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. This is a weekly podcast featuring in-depth interviews with today's leading writers. It is good to be with you. Happy New Year. Hope you had good holidays. If you didn't have good holidays, I hope you're reveling in the fact that the holidays are now over and we get to face 2025, whatever that means. It's going to be weird. Maybe weird at best. I don't know what it's going to be. But it's going to happen. So we got to just deal with it, I guess. I don't know what else to do. I'm just going to keep making shows. And writing books. And reading books. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow me on social media, TikTok, Instagram, and Blue Sky. So today I'm going to be doing a Craftwork episode. Once again, if you're new to the show, a Craftwork episode deals with some aspect of the craft of writing or the business of publishing. In today's case, we're going to be dealing with an aspect of the craft of writing. I'll be talking with Joshua Mohr about how to write revisionist history, which is to say how to begin with real-life events and people, and then turn those real-life events and people into compelling, propulsive, absorbing, and ethical fiction. Again, my guest is Joshua Mohr. He is celebrating the publication of a trilogy of novels this year, the first of which is called Saint the Terrifying, available from Unnamed Press. Saint the Terrifying is about music. It's about punk rock. It is about community and individual identity and activism and vigilantism. It's a detective story, and it interweaves recent history into its pages, namely the ghost ship warehouse fire, that great tragedy in Oakland of a few years ago. The ghost ship was a warehouse space in Oakland that was turned into an artist collective, a kind of communal living arrangement off the books, and there was a concert at the space, and there was a terrible fire caused, I think, by electrical issues, wiring issues, and in the end, 36 people lost their lives, making it the deadliest fire in Oakland history. So a terrible, terrible tragedy, and one that Joshua Mohr is addressing in this new trilogy of his, which is very much a revisionist history and an act of reclamation. I'll be talking with Joshua Mohr about how to write revisionist history in just a bit. A quick reminder that I do a weekly email newsletter. You can subscribe over at Substack. I would love it if you did that. Today's episode is brought to you by Harper Books, publisher of the novel The Capital of Dreams by Heather O'Neill. The Capital of Dreams is a dark dystopian fairy tale about an idyllic country ravaged by war and a girl torn between safety and loyalty. Publishers Weekly, in a starred review, calls The Capital of Dreams, quote, a haunting fantasy. And Kirkus, in a starred review, calls it, quote, a powerful novel, heartbreaking, magical, and real. The Capital of Dreams is a vivid, breathtaking, dark fairy tale of life, death, and betrayal. One more time. The book is called The Capital of Dreams. It is the new novel by Heather O'Neill, available from Harper. All right, so let's get going with today's Craftwork episode, how to write revisionist history. My guest is Joshua Mohr, author of a new trilogy of novels to be published in a single year, the first of which is called Saint the Terrifying, available from Unnamed Press. Joshua Mohr is the author of several books, including Damascus, Some Things That Meant the World to Me, and Termite Parade. He is on this program, I believe, for the third time. This is his third appearance, and I am happy to welcome him back, and I hope you enjoy this conversation about writing revisionist history. Here he is, folks. This is Joshua Mohr.
I don't think I would have even had the language to call it that at first when I interacted with a piece of art that like completely blew my wig back, working in sort of revisionist history modes. But it was when I was in graduate school, a professor put a copy of E.L. Doctorow's The Book of Daniel in my hands, and I had never read anything like it before. What it really is it's a story, it's an imagined future for one of the Rosenberg children. And so we're seeing him as a man dealing with the detritus and the legacies of his parents being murdered by the government. But we're also then hopping in our time machine and going back, and the novelist has the capacity to go back and invent conversations, invent relationships between the tertiary characters and the primary characters, and it became this really beautiful and unctuous puzzle. What's real? What's not real? And I just found it to be so arresting and so dynamic. I wanted to figure out how the storyteller was able to pull these things off. I'm such a firm believer that a writer should be trying to write the book that she wants to read. And that made an indelible impression on me. And it's one of the books that I read every 12 to 18 months. Maybe you have like the Desert Island books. I use that as a way to keep myself sharp. So I have five or six novels that I think are written by stone cold killers that I'll kind of revisit every year and a half or so to sort of keep my skills where I would like to keep my skills. The other big influence, though, wasn't a book. It was in 2019 when Tarantino put out Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
I was going to say, I feel like Tarantino has made an industry out of revisionist history.
Yeah, he's great at it. But it was that last one that really spoke to me. And I think one of the reasons I loved it so much is A, it came out right before the pandemic. So the shitty like indie movie theater near my place in Seattle was playing it during the pandemic because there were no other titles. And so I probably went to see it in the theater 15 or 20 times. And I was like a fancy rich guy because I was the only person in the movie theater. It was like I had a screening room. And we come to the end of the movie, right? And all of a sudden, he's saving Sharon Tate's life, and he's saving her friend's life. And I had a moment where I sat there and was like, I want to try to do something like this for punk rockers. I want to try to do something for the people in my world that mean the most to me. And there had been this, tragedy in the Bay Area a few years ago called the Ghost Ship Fire, where there was a concert happening in a warehouse space and 36 people lost their lives. And I was thinking to myself, while I was in the movie theater watching Sharon Tate be alive, is there a way that I can use my art to keep these people with us? I think the first moral question somebody writing in a revisionist history has to ask herself is, am I using this in an exploitative way, or is this a project of reclamation? And you really want to sit with that. I mean, that's very spiritual, that's very existential, and don't rush and really like take the litany, like why you want to do this, why you feel called to do this. And in my world, it was as simple as like, these are typically pretty marginalized people. And I was worried that they were going to be forgotten. And so even, in the sequence of the book where I'm running the ghost ship fire, I list all 36 people by name. What I'm hoping is that when people read that part of the book, that they choose to say those names out loud. And in that way, the artifact becomes this conduit for us to be constantly remembering those that didn't make it out of the fire.
Well, I think it's very moving when it's done well. I felt moved by the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I don't often feel moved in a kind of tender way by a Tarantino film.
Right, right. Well, the thing that he made one really cool decision that I thought about for a long time afterward. And it's, when after all the violence has happened and the Manson family got what the Manson family needed to get, head smashed in, lit on fire with the flamethrower. obviously. The first time we hear from the Sharon Tate character after that, we don't see Margot Robbie in person. It's just the voice over the intercom at her house. And it always felt like a moment where we were hearing from an angel. Like this was a voice sort of sent down from heaven. I would love to have the opportunity to ask Quentin if that was what went into that decision. But I'm right with you. Like it was the first time I'd ever seen a Quentin Tarantino movie. And I was like, holy shit, am I about to fucking cry?
Right, right.
Like, I love his movies, but I've never been emotionally moved in such a poignant way before. And again, I'm sitting in this empty movie theater completely by myself, thinking like, that's what I want to do. Revisionist history can be very dry. How do we do it in a way that's going to sort of activate the feels? So the audience has the opportunity to feel as viscerally involved with the action as she can possibly feel.
I'm curious to know if there's anything more to it, like in your exploration of this, like when you're trying to define it in just a broad sense, is it simply messing with history, like changing the details of history in a narrative, fictionalizing them? Like, what else is there to it? Am I missing anything?
Well, when I was prepping for us to nerd out today, I was looking up some definitions of it, and listen to how dry these things are. Revisionist history is a narrative that changes an accepted interpretation of historical events or offers a different perspective that has conventionally been taken on by historians. That's fine. This is the other one I wanted to highlight to you. Revisionist history refers to the conscious and intentional misstatements about things in the past, whether distant or recent. Obviously, that's true. I have no problem with that. But the thing that I think, thinking of being a storyteller, those sound like PhD candidates or deconstructionists to me. But I want to approach this conversation, as a capital A artist. So the one that I cooked up this morning is just simply revisionist history is the act of joyfully remixing the past. And I think that adverb joyfully is incredibly important here because it then sort of activates, what's unique and what's vibrant about every storyteller's imagination. How do you bring another era to dynamic life? I always tell my graduate students, it's not your audience's job to be interested in your book. Like it's your book's job to make your audience interested in it. And historical fiction can be whatever we want it to be. Revisionist history can be whatever we want to be. There has to be that kernel of truth, of course. And then we get to sort of wildly and contort it to come up with this outlandish, wild story that's unlike anything that your audience has ever experienced before. So I think that adverb joyfully is really, really important in the alchemy here. What's going to inspire that artist to string her artistic high wire at the most nauseating altitude? Like, how are we risking public humiliation with the next book that we're cooking up? Like, I think these are really important things for us to be asking ourselves on a project by project basis so we don't go on autopilot, so we don't get soft, right? So we keep making sure that on each book, we keep learning, we keep growing. Like, my goal in my career is to remain an apprentice forever. Like I just want to keep like learning and learning and metabolizing and spitting out new crazy books for everybody.
Well, and when it comes to revisionist history, you sort of touched on this earlier, but it's worth diving into a bit more. There are ethical obligations that you have as a writer. You have to really understand the difference between exploitation and reclamation.
Yep.
And how did you do that? How do you do that effectively?
I started with thinking about appropriation in the sense that oftentimes when we talk about appropriation, it's sort of reduced to either being about gender or race. Obviously, those are very important conversations too. But thinking about how I was going to try to work in a revisionist history mode, it was about culture, meaning that, like, can I tell this story from inside the culture, or am I sort of outside the culture looking in like it's a bunch of animals at the zoo? When I was 17, I moved into San Francisco and was living in a punk house. So, like, this is the world, these are the ecosystems that I know culturally. So, I'm never approaching anything as a tourist. So it became an exercise of like, I already feel like I'm a member of the tribe authentically, right? So I don't have to worry about being a poser here. Then if you pass the culture test, then the next question is, okay, am I trying to capitalize on the deaths of other people? And again, I think you should go painstakingly slow as you're sort of interrogating your answers to these really important and loaded questions. And if you come out of it, that maze of questions, and your answer is like, I'm doing this for the right reasons. And the right reasons, at least in my world, are I'm trying to honor the dead. I want to make sure that these people are not forgotten. And in that sense, I was able to say, to look myself in the mirror anyway, and to say, like, my motives are pure. This isn't about capitalism, right? This is about me figuring out how to take these broken toys. And that's the thing about a punk house. I mean, technically, the ghost ship where this fire happened was not a punk house. That was one of the things I had to sort of bend through the revisionist history lens. But one of the things I love about punk houses or any sort of ecosystem like this is we all come to these places because we're not welcome other places, right? We're too queer, we're too arty, we're too black, we're too brown, we're too fill in the blank. And suddenly you come to SF or LA or Detroit or DC, whatever it happens to be, and you find the other people that weren't welcome. And you have the opportunity to build this kind of tribe of beautiful sinners. And in that sense, it's the most exciting family because it's the family that you want. Finally, around these sort of like-minded people. So I was kind of always just asking myself, if I'm writing from in the punk house, if I'm writing about the people that would live with me, then I know that I'm doing the right thing moving forward.
What about survivors of the people who died and any kind of contact with them? I mean, I don't think it's obligatory, but have you thought of that? Of like, wow, I wonder if any of these people's surviving relatives are going to read this or friends might read this book.
Yeah, gosh, I would love for that to happen. Absolutely. The journalist, there's a kind of a weekly rag in the East Bay called the East Bay Express. And the people who covered the ghost ship fire won the Pulitzer Prize from the East Bay Express. So I was able to lean on their coverage. It was so thorough. I used a lot of that, and then the Oakland PD had a bunch of body cam footage that I was able to sort of sift through. And then at the end of the day, you say to yourself, like, that was another question that you ask yourself on your litany. Like, okay, if somebody's friend, if somebody's family was to happen to read this weird book called Saint the Terrifying, would it pass the sniff test on their side? I haven't heard from any of those people directly, but I would love to, for sure.
What about the things that you change fictionally? Can you like point to some of the places where you really bent reality to fit your fiction?
Yeah, for sure. I think, the revisionist history lens also needs to be tethered so closely to character. Whenever we start to work in these sort of like cerebral modes, it can very quickly turn into like somebody sitting around and smelling their own farts. So then it's a matter of like, how do I let revisionist history be as character driven as it can possibly be? Because it's just at the end of the day, it's another mode of telling a story. And stories, the ones that really stick with us, maybe there's a book that you love that's about your connection to the plot line. But I bet the majority of the books that like you truly, truly adore, it's about your connection to those characters in one way or another. I have written on my office wall at home big block letters in Sharpie. I'm certainly not getting my security deposit back at that place. It just says the dignity of complexity. And that's what I'm always seeking. Certainly with the characterization of my primary players, I always want to imbue them with the dignity of complexity, but also with my tertiary characters. How can I make them as complicated and alive and confused as the rest of us? If our job as novelists is to replicate real deal life, how can I give them those same kind of bemusing assignments that we all sort of carry around in our hearts, like, shoes thumping in the dryer. So I want to make it as character driven as it can possibly be. So I don't want the ghost ship fire itself to just be like this thing that's happening. I want it to be springing forth organically based on the circumstances of my protagonist. So this guy, Saint, our main character, is having a very complicated day. And he's going back to his place to get a shield and to get an axe. And as he pulls up in his car, the building's on fire. So, we know as novelists that the best scenes, the scenes that are going to showcase the most active characters, which I think is sort of the high watermark that we're all seeking out, we want to really play to the decision making, the logic, and the moral center of that one character. So when Saint pulls up, he's just living his life. Now this building's on fire. Now he has to deal with this. All he wants to do is get inside and get his axe and get his shield. But as he's looking up onto the second story art space, he can see that the room's on fire and he can see that there's a bunch of people inside. And he contains a very unique set of skills. He was raised in the wilds of Norway, and his father raised him in the traditions of the Viking. Like he was learning Glima, the Viking martial art, by 12 years old. He was wrestling bears by the time he was 13 years old. Like this guy's a badass is badass. And in fact, my joke when I started to write the book was I wanted to create a character that was like, what if Johnny Rotten had a baby with The Rock? And so that was sort of our way into kind of calibrating this weird person. So my point of all this is like he has a very clean and discreet want. I just want to get my axe. I just want to get my shield, whatever happens to be. And then the obstacle is, oh my God, the building's on fire. And so then that creates a brand new want for him. There's 36 people in there. Those 36 people are going to die in the fire if it's the real world, our world. But this is Saint's world. This is a parallel reality. And he has the capacity and he has the skills to get these people out still alive.
I think that what you're talking about here, at least in part, has to do with setting and the story world that you create, which is very much based on reality, but is like slightly skewed, right? Much like it
Yep.
is in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where it's this kind of dream.
1,000%.
It's like this dreamlike version of a place that I know well because I live in Los Angeles, but I think most of us have at least an image of what it is
Right.
to be in Hollywood, and yet it's not quite Hollywood. And that's the case with you. That's the case with you in the East Bay in your book.
Yep. Yep. Well, I was thinking, when I teach this, we talk about the difference between objective setting and subjective setting. And that's a phrase that's really important to me as a novelist, subjective setting. And the example that I always like to use is we can probably all agree that objectively Van Gogh's Starry Night is a beautiful picture. Like I think most people would say, a hater might not say that. But for the majority of us, we would agree with that. I would say it's a subjectively beautiful picture if you know that that was the view out of his mental hospital window. And so suddenly it isn't just the object itself, it's the subject. It's the fact that what the artist happens to be dealing with at that particular moment. So yes, we're looking out the window with him, but if we know the story, then we get to see the sort of haunting ecosystem. What's going on in his head, what's going on in his heart, what's going on in the asylum. And that sort of stew is making him capable in his bipolar way of seeing this lovely image out the window. So subjective setting is something that I'm always thinking about with my characterizations. Everything around my character has the opportunity to be a Rorschach test. Like I could take an objective setting statement like this: the leaves are falling off of that tree, period. All right, I guess that's doing some work. Or I could add a simile or a metaphor toward the end of that. And I could change it to the leaves are falling off of that tree, comma, like dying butterflies. And the question then becomes, is that telling you more about the tree or is that telling you more about how I see the world? So I'm always trying to sort of tether the idiosyncrasies and the nuances of my character's sort of immediate surroundings and use those as an opportunity for me to sort of understand the invisible drama of the human heart. it's another kind of byproduct way of us to really understand what truly matters to these principal characters.
There's always a like an unlimited amount of creative license that I think one should take when writing a novel. But with a novel like this, I can imagine that the choices might seem more perilous. And yet you have to give yourself permission, right? Like you have to give yourself permission to fictionalize if you're going to go in. It's like trying to walk this line between being liberated, but also having like a deep sense of responsibility, like we've been talking about, to the dead
Absolutely.
and to the living they left behind.
Yep. And there's also that other responsibility to the audience, like to make it entertaining, to make it fun as hell. So how do you make it entertaining and fun as hell, and then also try to honor the dead at the same time? I mean, this was something that could have gone sideways so fast. But I have an 11-year-old daughter, and we make a lot of art together. So we'll like listen to vinyl in the evening, and she's drawing or writing, and I'm doing the same thing. And one day, and as a father, you'll appreciate this. Out of nowhere, she said to me, "Daddy, do you know that our comfort zones are our doom zones?" And I was like, "What? God, am I raising a genius?" And that's really stuck with me, to been like, I'm far enough along in my career that I know that I can go on autopilot and write a fine book, right? But I don't want to do that. I don't want to stay in my comfort zone. And this felt like there were so many third rails, right, that could go wrong. It was really exciting as a storyteller to be like, oh my gosh, there's so much. We always ask what's at stake for our characters. And of course, that's a beautiful question. But I think we should also ask another question of ourselves. What's at stake for us? What are we risking here? And that question to me is very intoxicating and really brought out the best in my work ethic and my imagination as I got deeper into the process.
Well, you bring up a very good and somewhat obvious point, but it's that if you're putting a book out into the world and it's a work of revisionist history, it's not necessarily going to be the case that the reader who picks the book up is going to be super invested in the history that you're
Yep.
revising. And so, and I guess what you're saying is you try to make the book interesting and entertaining to that reader as well. It's not just the reader who was super invested in the Ghost Ship story or who
Yep.
is a super huge fan of Sharon Tate who is going to be able to watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and get something from it. I feel like you could come cold to that movie or to your book and walk away feeling like you got like a fair shake as like
Yeah, and I think it has to be written in that way. Whereas, like, you can come in with this with a completely pristine slate about Sharon Tate, the Manson family, or the Ghost Ship fire, and it's the storyteller's job to tell you a kick-ass and compelling beginning, middle, and an ending. And if you know these other details, like, it's going to make you lean forward even more to kind of like watch them walk the high wire. But without having access to that information, it should still feel really fun and self-contained and emotionally volatile. Like all the good things that we appreciate and want, novels to be, whether they're, historical novels, contemporary novels, dystopic novels. We all just want to be entertained at the end of the day. Like, do I want to think? Do I want the feels? Absolutely. But I don't think any of those things should be mutually exclusive. I think we should be able to try to do those jobs all at the same time as novelists.
so for somebody listening who's a writer who might want to try their hand at this like subgenre, I guess you would call it. I think there is maybe at the outset the issue of what history to revise. And we sort of talked about how you want to be doing it for the right reasons. It's probably going to be good for you as a writer to pick something that really is deeply meaningful to you and has some
Yeah.
emotional impact on you. But when I think of your book, or just to keep using the Tarantino example, these histories that are being revised are much larger than themselves. There are
Mm.
socioeconomic, political, cultural, even historical lines that feed into them and that don't necessarily make their way into the narratives explicitly.
Right.
but yet you can maybe feel them in there, and that's part of what gives them their power. Like the Ghost Ship story uh, is more than just a bunch of punk rockers in a warehouse.
Yep.
It's about housing in the Bay Area. It's about the socioeconomics of that. It's about marginalized communities. It contains a lot. And I'm curious to know, in your research and in your creative process, how much of it was subterranean in the finished product. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like trying to kind of
Yeah.
like see it all, understand it all, and then make creative decisions about what to include and what to
Right.
leave beneath the surface.
Yeah, one of my favorite writers is Grace Paley. And she was obviously a great poet and great short story writer, but from what I understand, she was even better in the classroom. And she said something to her students that I ape on every time I have the opportunity. And she used to say that, like, I know I've written one story when I've written two stories. The idea that, like, there has to be a literal action, but there also has to be a subtextual action sort of thrumming beneath the surface. And she would never consider a piece of hers done until she had doted evenly on both planes of storytelling. So that's a question that I'm constantly asking myself as I'm, especially in the nascent drafts. What should fall in sort of the jurisdiction of the literal action? What's the stuff that should stay subtextual? I mean, a lot of the things that you were just mentioning would sort of fall under that umbrella of gentrification. And it, like, nothing makes somebody want to like lean over and throw up all over the floor and someone starts talking about gentrification, right? So you immediately feel like you're trying to feed the audience their fucking vegetables, and like they don't want to eat their vegetables. Like they want you to tell them a story. So in my world, I wish I had a more efficient answer than this, but I have to try it both ways. Like I always try to say that my loyalty is to the narrative and never to my own hubris. And what that means is that I try not to do too much troubleshooting in my skulls. I try to make all of the mistakes in the wild of the book. So I'll try things in the literal plane, see how it plays. Maybe that was okay, maybe it wasn't. I'll try it on the subtextual plane, test drive it, see how it's going to work, see how it doesn't. But you're completely right in that, like, if you're talking about a punk house, right? If you're talking about people who are working, at best at a barista job, right? Tattoo artists, these sorts of things, like, they don't have a lot of means, And in fact, one of the guys I lived at in the punk house, the place that he lived on right before he moved in with us, was he was burying himself in the sand at Ocean Beach, and I would pick him up. We were both working at the General Nutrition Center, dude. And I would pick him up, but he's all sandy, and we would go to work together. And so, like, when you're talking about that kind of poverty, again, you have to talk about it from the inside of the culture. Otherwise, it seems like you're like, ooh, look at that person. That's gross. Ooh, look at that person. They don't have much. But I'm not doing that, right? These are my friends. Like, these are the people that I've come up with. And however the hell this happened, we're all still alive. So it gave me an opportunity, because the protagonist in the book is much younger than I am. I'm almost 50 now. And it sort of gave me the opportunity to hop in my time machine and remember what it was like to be in my early 20s. I don't know about you, but one of the things I absolutely miss about that age, is I was mad. Like, I was furious about the things that had happened to me growing up. And I mean, on one hand, yes, I'm glad I'm not mad every day. I'm glad that I've ultimately healed as I've been alive. But I kind of miss that fury sometimes, that fucking fire. Like, you remember what that felt like?
I don't know if I
Uh,
maybe I guess maybe I had it in different forms, but yeah, yeah, that definitely that like angry, confused young man energy.
Right. Well, and I don't think it's gendered. I know a lot of women who are, and there's a couple female characters in the book. One's named Trick Wilma, and I'm hearing from female readers all the time. They're like, "Oh my God, this female punk rocker is so, so, so fun." And I think one of the reasons that I was able to do that is because I don't write backstory. Like, backstory is usually the thing that people mess up the most. And it's because they are telling it from this perch in time. Like, here I am as the thoughtful, fastidious novelist, and I have these like Einsteinian space-time binoculars, and now I get to look back in the past. And it just has the veneer of distance. Like when I'm writing backstory, I say to myself, like, they don't know they're in a flashback. Like they don't know it's backstory. To them, it's today. And in fact, it isn't today, it's right this second. So how can you write with that sort of, visceral sizzle, that thing that makes them feel as most composed, whatever that word means in that particular context, and trying to bring that story to life. So in a weird way, this project of revisionist history also sort of allowed me to slip in a previous iteration of myself to try to honor it in the most character driven way that I can. And conventional wisdom says, write the book that you want to read. And like, of course, I have no problem with that. But I do think it's an exciting opportunity for us to take it a step further and to say, how can you write the book that only you can write? And I did so much research on like the Viking and the Norse culture, and then I'm combining that with my day-to-day experience, like living steeped in sort of this punk rock culture, and I put it together in a way that I'm the only person, for better or worse, who could have written this book. And I think that's so important to me as a storyteller, to try to be doing something that doesn't just sound like a remix of a remix of a remix. I've been joking with people a lot right now that when I read a lot of contemporary books, it feels like Beige Against the Machine. Like I've heard this before. Like it sounds like this and it sounds like that and it sounds like that. And I just wish that what we're trying to champion, what we're truly trying to champion in the marketplace, is everybody's very unique and vibrant imagination. Like I want to hear the story that only you can tell. And I wish that was the only North Star that we're seeing on the horizon, but I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's kind of an interesting contradiction almost, that in writing a revisionist history that implicates a lot of people, the only way to make it succeed in the end is to make it personal.
Absolutely. And perhaps we could even make the argument, we can extrapolate that out and say that one of the beautiful dichotomies of narrative construction is that the only time we can say something highfalutin about humankind is via one individual's consciousness. It's one very flawed human heart that lives in one very confused animal. And if we nail that with the requisite level of intimacy, then she has the capacity and the power to stand for something far greater than herself.
It's interesting to me that you wrote this character sort of based on yourself and made him a master of Viking martial arts. That's kind of cool.
Well, it's funny because I'm super good friends with Pam Houston. And when Pam read the first draft of Saint, she goes, I feel like this is just like you without having to go to jail.
But
And I was like, I'll take that, sure.
well, no, but the word that it brings up for me is fun, because that should be a part of it too. And
Yeah, man.
that joy, that fun, that spirit of play, even in a very dark story, needs to somehow be there, I think, for at least most writers, in order to sustain the work that goes into it over a long period of time.
Well, two really cool things happened during the pandemic to me. One was my daughter asked us about our heritage, and I'm like one of those American mutts that doesn't know anything about where I came from. I knew I was half German. I knew I was half Norwegian. I knew that those particular cultures, maybe I didn't want to learn too much about my family of origin. But she asked me about the Norwegian stuff, so we went to the Nordic Museum. And I was just sort of walking around there being like, oh my God, this is amazing. Because we were all inside and bored during the pandemic, I started to read a bunch of Icelandic Viking sagas. And it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is every genre imaginable. It's horror, it's fantasy, it's magical realism. These are love stories, these are family sagas. And I would be able to do that all at the same time. So, what if I took the framework of an Icelandic Viking saga, plopped it in, a punk house in the 21st century, and used this project of revisionist history as the clockwork to sort of keep the plot chugging? So going to that museum was really, really exciting. But this is the thing during the pandemic that like was just a game changer in my artistic life, is that I had just sold a television show to AMC right before lockdown happened, and they obviously wiped their development slate. So now I suddenly didn't have my show, and I was very much feeling sorry for myself. There were people in the world who had real fucking problems, right? But I was in the basement feeling sorry about my dumb TV show. And I was driving my wife crazy, and she was like, "I'm going to stab you in your sleep unless you start to do something artistic." So we had a pod of the neighborhood girls together, and my wife's like, "Write a script for the kids to perform." And I was like, "That sounds like a fate worse than death. I'm not going to do that." And she said, "Yes, you are." So I did it. I wrote this little script. My wife is like the man of the house, and while I was writing the script, she built literally in our front yard this theater edifice. And across the top, she wrote the Silly Gooses Theater Company, because that's what our daughter Ava always says to us. "Let's be silly gooses tonight." So I wrote this little script and we put the show on. And even the other parents of the other kids didn't want to come, right? It was just the kids and us and maybe one or two others. But I had to write another one, and I had to write another one, and I had to write another one. And Brad, the craziest thing happened. People started to show up, right? There's 10 people in our front yard. Even the mean widow down the block, even she showed up with a plate of peanut butter cookies. And the story that I'm trying to tell you is this one show. I wrote this little script where the girls were going to fly to the moon so they could sing a song with David Bowie. And they're up there with their little makeshift astronaut helmets on, and they're holding this big rocket. And they're singing a song, and everybody on the lawn is crying. And we're not crying because we're scared. And we're not crying because we're going to lose our job. And we're not crying because of that loved one across the country that we're not sure that we're going to see again. We were crying because our kids were on the moon singing a song with David Bowie. And it was so, so, so beautiful. And I went inside and I wrote 2 words down on a piece of paper. I wrote down the words that I pinged you when I first emailed you. It said demented whimsy. Like, I watched these girls systematically take everybody apart with the power of their art, singing a song on the moon. And I knew that I wanted to try to do something similar in my next creative project. And that's how Saint the Terrifying came to be.
Wow. There's something about kids singing.
Oh my God, for sure. Because they're awful at it. It's so charming.
Yeah. There's just they have like no guile or something. They're just like so
It's
open-hearted.
just so
That's
earnest,
right. That's what
right?
yeah.
Like, they don't care about being sharp or being flat or being on the beat. None of that matters. It's just self-expression for self-expression's sake. And I think, coming out of lockdown, like, this is the era of zero fucks art. Like, if you're not making exactly what you want to be making right now, you are not paying attention to what's happening in the world. And so I think this is a really exciting time to be an artist. I think this is a really exciting time to be creating.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you came across trying to write your revisionist history? Was there anything in particular that really got you or you struggled with?
I was glad to have already published a memoir. So I had a book called Model Citizen come out a couple years ago, where I really sort of had to wrestle with the moral implications of writing about my friends and family. It's impossible to tell anybody's story in sort of a hermetically sealed way. You're going to have to talk about the people that you interact with that exist in your environment and your family, so on and so forth. So I was glad I had to ask myself a lot of those really, really hard questions when I was putting Model Citizen together. And I was able to sort of superimpose a lot of those lessons here, where I was really thinking about all of the 36 people who died in the fire. I had their name written on the wall under the dignity of complexity. I had everybody's first and last name. And I was sort of just using it as a way to keep checking my work. Uh, what would she say about this sentence? She wouldn't like that line. Fuck it. That's hitting the cutting room floor. Keep typing. He's calling bullshit on that. So in a weird way, like, their ghosts and their angels like became these like lovely proofreaders. to kind of help me course correct if I was taking things in a different direction than the story needed to be going in.
So, are you going to do more of these?
Well, the fun thing is that the Saint the Terrifying is the first book in this trilogy. So I have three books coming out this year, which is so bananas. It's been really, really fun. So I think about it as one continuous 1,000-page Viking saga that's told in punk rock West Oakland. So the first book is, the ghost ship story in one way or another, and then we take it in all sorts of like crazy, deranged ways from there. But the Viking saga gave me sort of permission to really go in this genre-less direction, or maybe it's not genre-less; it's just going toward every genre and it kind of inspecting them to say like, oh, I get to cherry pick, right? I want a little bit of this, I want a little bit of that, I want a little bit of that, and I get to joyously remix it and let it be whatever it wants to be moving forward. I wear a tattoo from Picasso that says, the chief enemy of creativity is good taste. And I've been thinking a lot about that as I've been writing this crazy trilogy or crazy one long serialized saga. And what I'm hoping is that people either love it or hate it. Like I want like 5-star reviews are fine, 1-star reviews are fine, but like fuck your 3-star reviews. You know what I mean? Like I don't want ambivalence here. Like I want you to think this is amazing, or I want you to think I'm a hack. And again, like that's punk rock culture. Like you either love Bad Brains or you hate Bad Brains. You either love butthole surfers or you hate butthole surfers.
There's no middle ground.
And yeah, and so you want to write to go again to go back to full circle, like writing from inside the culture, like ethically. That's the ethos of punk rockers. That's the aesthetic. That's the style. We don't want everybody to like what we do. Like that's part of the attitude that those sorts of artworks are constructed with.
So, a word that I want to touch upon is remix, because I think that quality to revisionist history, when it's done well, is is worth emphasizing. It's not simply going back into a moment in history or an episode in history and rejiggering it. What I'm hearing you say, and what we can look to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and see as well, is that you're bringing so much more to the story and remixing it.
Yeah.
It's this trip to the Nordic Museum. It's all of this ancient Viking lore that you read and were moved by. It's your own personal experiences in a punk house, coming of age in San Francisco. Or for Tarantino, it's his love of like old like Western TV shows like Bonanza, his love
Yep. Yep.
of sort of like not hack actors, but like working actors who aren't maybe huge stars. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like those kinds of everyday actors from back in the day, and maybe just his love of a certain era in Hollywood as well, like that time, the 60s, 70s era in Hollywood that he really has great affection for. And so it's a blend, and that's as it should be. I think that maybe
Yeah.
sometimes when people get started on a project, especially if it's dealing with the real or the actual or some bit of history, they might feel like this really intense like devotion to the idea of getting it right or
Yep.
making it.
Well, and I think that fealty that you're getting at is poison. Or it's maybe if that's too strong way to word it, it's certainly going to get in the way of what the novelist needs to do in order to do her job right. And the novelist needs to feel that latitude and that liberty to create. Think about that old, was it the Kafka thing? Like, the bird that goes in search of a cage. Sometimes those sort of incarcerations actually give our imagination those freedoms because now we have the structure. And so, what are we going to do within that structure? I know I wanted to write about the ghost ship fire, but I also wanted to maintain access to all of the cool tools that we have in our novelist toolbox. And I was not going to obfuscate myself from any of the wonderful options that we have at our disposal. Like, our job is to make shit up. Our job is to tell compelling stories. Our job is to, in one way or another, be seeking out verisimilitude. So why wouldn't I give myself access to all the things that we have at our disposal to bring these things to life? I think what you said about Tarantino is really, really important, though, that it emanated from a place. It's a love letter. Like he's writing a love letter to a previous iteration of Hollywood, right? I'm writing a love letter to punks, to subculture, to people who are on the outside, the people that are on the margins. I mean, I've been writing about these people for years because these people are my friends. This is how I came up. I love the prodigals. I love those of us where it takes just a little bit longer to learn how to love us because we don't know how to get out of our own way. And if you can bring that kind of empathy to people who are gross or people who should be dismissed, I mean, I think that's the healing power of art. I'm willfully naive enough to believe that art can teach us empathy. Despite all evidence to the contrary, I will go to my grave believing that, even if that's a delusion, because that's what I have to believe in order to do my job the way that I want to do it.
So for somebody listening who has an interest in this and thinks they might want to write it, but is just frozen or thinking to themselves like,
Yeah.
oh God, where do I start? Like I've got my thing. I know the bit of history that I would love to reclaim, but I don't know even what the first step would be.
Yeah. The first step for me is always capital C character. Forget genre for a second. Like that's how I'm always want to start a creative project. But looking at it through the lens of the conversation that we're having right now, hopefully the checklist would go something like this. I think revisionist history seems like postmodern and cool. I would like to try that. All right, that's number one. Number two, then, is simply like, okay, what is the story that you love in your bones? But I want to ape on something that the great Paul Harding says. One of the reasons I love to teach at festivals and conferences is that I get to sneak into other people's craft talk and listen to them nerd out. And Paul said something, dude, one time that just like fucking floored me. He said, write what you know, but never write what you understand. And I think that is a really important alchemical ingredient here in the revisionist history standpoint. Like, it doesn't make sense to me why 36 people went to listen to music and all died in a fire. I don't understand that, right? And that dissonance, or that friction, maybe is a better word, is that opportunity for artistic investigation. So once you decide you want to work in revisionist history, once you feel like you know what that thing is that you want to write that love letter to, then ask yourself, what don't you understand about that? And if you can't come up with a good answer for that, maybe this isn't the right decision for this particular creative project, or it's just going to require some more nimble and limber thinking until you find what that is. The thing that exists in there that will never make sense to you, no matter how long you try to parse it. And then from there, the next question is character. Who is the right person to set in these plot mechanics to bring it to dynamic life? Like you can put anybody there that you can cook up. Who's it going to be? And so I started to build Saint from that question. I didn't understand that. Knew it was going to be a punk house. So he had to be a punk. What kind of punk was he? In fact, the really cool thing is he plays in a band called Slummy. And I was like, I need to hear what his music sounds like in order to do my job right as the novelist. So it was just me in my basement, man. I just demoed a couple songs. I didn't think anybody was ever going to hear these songs. These were just for me. And then when I told my publisher about it, I sent him an MP3 and he was like, let's cut the record. So I went into the studio with a couple of musicians and we actually made Saints Band's record, which is sort of another way that this project is this postmodern puzzle. So I'm in a real fake band called Slummy. And again, it all comes back to like make the art that only you can make. You know, like these are the things that I love and the most in the world. I love punk rock, I love books, I love Vikings, all of these things. I was able to figure out the perfect vehicle to bring it to life.
Well, yeah, listening to you, I'm thinking that this is probably the way that it goes most of the time for writers who are writing in this vein. Like, I could imagine that Quentin Tarantino sitting down to write Once Upon a Time probably didn't start with Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate necessarily. That was sort of a given, but to get to them, he had to create I'm forgetting the names, but the
right.
Brad Pitt and the Leonardo DiCaprio characters.
The buddy cop, right.
Yeah, he had to get that storyline first as like a bridge almost to get to the people and the history that he wanted to write into.
I bet it was a very similar exercise. Like, Sharon Tate lives in this house. I need somebody else to live next door. Who is the exact right person to put there? And then you start to build that character in wisps and sketches and generalities. And then slowly, when you keep showing up with an open heart and open ears, and that character keeps whispering their secrets back to you, that's when we manufacture that dignity of complexity we were talking about for our characters earlier.
Well, it's like that the old phrase, like, history is written by the winners, is coming to mind for me, because I feel like this kind of literary art or cinematic art gives creators the opportunity to like write history for the losers.
Absolutely.
To tell the stories of the
Absolutely.
people who don't necessarily get heard oftentimes.
And then suddenly we're right back at that word reclamation, right? So it isn't about, like, trying to do anything seedy or underhanded or yucky and self-enterprising with it. It's more about, like, people should know what happened to you. Everybody should know what your name is. You didn't just die in a fire at 22 years old and no one's going to hear this story. I'm not going to let that happen. And I want to say it one more time, like, when and if people choose to read the book, when they come to that section of the book, please read those names out loud. Fucking yell them. Let your neighbors think you're completely and utterly deranged for 45 seconds. It'll be worth it. Be in conversation with them. Let them hear you. I mean, to me, this is what art is all about, man. This is all about the Silly Gooses Theater Company.
Well, I think that's a great place to close, unless there is anything that I did not touch upon with respect to revisionist history that you think listeners need to hear. Is there anything that we missed?
No, I'm looking at my notes here. I think we hit everything that we wanted to hit.
Well, it's always fun to talk with you. I feel fired up. You have like kind of a motivating presence. Like, there's something about listening to you speak that gets me excited to go make stuff.
At a tour stop last week, this woman goes, "You should start a cult." And I'm like, "Oh, maybe I should start a cult."
It's supposedly a big business. It's a good business to get into if you can hack it.
If you know a guy, let me know, Brad.
Yeah. I'll look around. I'm in LA. There's plenty of cults here, so I'm sure.
I would imagine so.
But it's great to see you. Congratulations on all that you have going, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
I really appreciate it, Brad. Keep fighting the good fight.
All right, everybody, there we have it. That was my conversation with Joshua Mohr about how to write a revisionist history. Joshua Mohr is publishing 3 novels in a single year, a trilogy, the first of which is called Saint the Terrifying, available now from Unnamed Press. For more on it and to learn more about Joshua Mohr and all of his work, visit joshuamohr.net. Follow him on Instagram. Again, the new novel is called Saint the Terrifying. Go get your copy right away. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. Hit the subscribe button and follow me on social media, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok. Sign up for my newsletter over at Substack and join the Other People Patreon community over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. To join the Other People book club, that is my book club, or to get an Other People sweatshirt or a t-shirt, just go to otherppl.com. If you have 2 minutes and you want to do me a quick favor, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. Write a little review if that's an option. It helps the show find new listeners. If you want to get my book, my latest book, it's a novel. It's called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook, so if that sounds interesting, Go get it. It's a novel called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. All right, so we're back. It's a new year, the 14th year, I believe. Is that right? Yeah, this is year 14 of the Otherppl show. And on Thursday, I will be back with my friend and co-host, Mira Gonzalez, for the first episode of Brad and Mira for the Culture in 2025. Stay tuned.